They expected ropes, not beds, not bread, and definitely not pie. In the final days of the North African campaign, thousands of Italian soldiers surrendered to Allied forces. Exhausted, starving, and broken by years of war, they stood barefoot in desert sands, waiting for their fate. For them, defeat didn't just sting, it terrified, because back in Italy, Mussolini had warned of exactly what would happen if they were captured. Execution. American soldiers, he'd promised, wouldn't take prisoners. They would hang you, humiliate you, and use your corpse as a warning to others. That fear didn't fade when the rifles went silent. It traveled with them into the backs of trucks, onto ships crossing the dark Atlantic, and into the pit of every gut, now certain their end was near. One whispered it in a holding pen, "They'll hang us in Times Square for the newspapers." But when the boots hit American soil, there were no ropes, no mobs, no firing squads. Instead, there was pumpkin pie. And what followed would unravel years of fear, propaganda, and loyalty, replacing them with something no one expected: kindness, calories, and confusion. Because these men had been told that surrender meant death. Instead, they were met with Thanksgiving dinner. What made the United States treat its former enemies this way? Was it strategy, some kind of twisted psychological warfare, or was it something else entirely? This is the story of how thousands of Italian soldiers, afraid, starving, and convinced they were walking toward their own executions, stepped into a place they thought was hell, and found something that still has historians scratching their heads. Because this isn't just a story about war. It's about how mercy can be more powerful than bullets. And how, in 1943, the most unlikely victory happened not on a battlefield, but in a mess hall. Section 1. The Surrender in the Desert. May 13th, 1943. The desert was finally quiet. No more smoke, no more screaming artillery, no more shouting officers pushing half-starved men to hold the line. Only wind and silence, and the sound of boots crunching across dry sand as Italian soldiers began stacking weapons they no longer had the will to use. The scene outside Tunis looked surreal, almost peaceful from a distance, but up close, you'd see it was the end of something brutal. Thousands of ragged men, scorched by sun and years of hopeless war, moving slowly through dunes, haunted by one shared thought: this is how it ends. They weren't just tired, they were hollow. Their bodies drawn to the bone by years of half-rations, diseases, heat stroke. Some were in their teens, soldiers in name only, barely old enough to shave. Others were veterans from Mussolini's earlier campaigns, men who had fought in Ethiopia and Greece, and had watched the fascist dream crumble into dust. And now, standing among piles of hastily abandoned rifles, they squinted into the evening sun and waited. Waited to die. Because the surrender might have been official, but the fear wasn't over. Not for them. Rumors had been crawling through the ranks for weeks, whispers louder than any command, terrifying stories smuggled in through fragments of overheard radio broadcasts, or in letters from home long since confiscated and censored. The Americans, it was said, don't take prisoners. According to the propaganda posters back home, they didn't shake hands, they didn't offer water, they didn't believe in mercy. They hanged people. From trees, from poles, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone, but always publicly as a warning. Italy's own leaders fed that fire. Mussolini had thundered from balconies that only cowards were captured, that if the Allies ever got their hands on Italian men, they would treat them like animals. Execution was inevitable. Surrender wasn't just defeat, it was betrayal. And now, right here in the African heat, thousands of Italian soldiers were living in that exact moment. Milling in dusty groups under the open sky, glancing nervously at the horizon. There was no enemy in sight, but the dread was already here. A strange ritual unfolded in the hours after surrender. Italian officers, some still too proud to speak directly to the enemy, gave vague instructions. Guns were placed gently in the sand, bayonets sticking skyward like metal thorns. Soldiers formed loose pyramids from their rifles, a surrender tradition that looked almost ceremonial, like some desert grave marker to a war no one wanted anymore. And still, there was no welcome, no capture truck, no American voices, just waiting and silence. And what came next? No one knew. One young soldier, only 18, looked around and whispered, "Do you think they'll make us dig the holes first?" Another murmured, "I heard they beat the Germans to death last month." No one answered. Instead, they shifted their weight, adjusted what was left of their uniforms, and looked to the sun sinking hard into the sand. One man removed his boots, the soles worn open like forgotten books, and stood barefoot on the hot earth, as if wanting to feel his homeland one last time. Another clutched silently at a medallion of St. Michael around his neck. Dozens carried similar charms: scraps of family photographs, ribbon from a daughter's braid, a torn letter folded in a shirt pocket, talismans, not of hope, of death. American trucks arrived just after sunset, covered with dust, their engines growling like uncertain beasts. As the headlights swept across the naked faces of the surrendered, jaws tightened. This was it. They expected hollery, dogs, guns, a command that none of them would understand but would recognize just the same. One soldier, his uniform stiff with salt and weeks of blood, closed his eyes, waiting for the first swing of a club, the first gunshot to the back of the skull, but it never came. Instead, a young American stepped down from the truck, 20 years old, if that, chewing gum like he was walking into a barn dance. He looked around casually, then reached into his pocket and tossed a pack of Lucky Strikes through the air toward the nearest Italian group. The cigarettes landed on the sand with a soft thud. No one moved. One man reflexively took 2 steps back, half expecting the pack to explode. Was it tainted? Poisoned? A sick joke? Then, slowly, one older soldier stooped, picked it up, turned it over, and laughed. Darkly, bitterly. "If they mean to hang us," he muttered, "at least they're letting us smoke first." No one laughed with him, but still that was the first crack in the wall. The coming hours didn't feel much clearer. The Americans began herding them into temporary enclosures, roped-off sections of desert with barbed tips. No commands were shouted. The American guards didn't strike anyone. They hardly spoke, just pointed. They were young too, scared maybe, bored. No torture, no firing squads, no humiliation, just silence, and the slow grind of wheels moving inland. The prisoners were taken in waves, transported by trucks further west. Day after day, watching the desert fade behind them as questions began to churn. Was this just a delay? Were they being marched to a mass grave? Were they filming it for newspapers? Someone whispered, "They'll show the world. They'll make us examples." Another encouraged, "Maybe we can escape." But the voices didn't last. Fear had strangled hope so thoroughly that even foolish escape fantasies died within minutes. The convoy rolled on through scrubland and low hills, through towns where Allied troops drank Coke in sidewalk cafes and children waved from balconies. Some prisoners tried not to look. Others watched with hollow eyes. They couldn't understand it. How did life go on this normally in the middle of a war? Back home, their cities had crumbled. Naples was starving. Rome had gone dark. Letters from mothers told of boiled weeds, of black markets, of bread lines that stretched 5 hours long. Their fathers, if still alive, coughed up dust from bombed-out shelters, while their sisters sold hair for soap. In war, everything hurt. But in these towns, the cafe umbrellas were upright, the buildings half-shelled but full of laughter. Allied soldiers kicked soccer balls in bombed courtyards. American jazz floated from crackling speakers. The Italians were stunned. Their enemy wasn't just alive. They were thriving. The strange kindness continued. Some Americans passed out gum. Some offered water. One even tossed a chocolate bar to a group of prisoners who reacted like he'd thrown a grenade. Rumors started again, but they sounded ridiculous. Someone said we're going to the United States. No, impossible. They wouldn't waste the boats. They'll kill us before that. I heard they feed prisoners there. Real meals. That's as likely as Mussolini shaking hands with the Pope. Whatever the truth was, the suspense dug deeper. The closer they got to the coast, the more intense the dread. Ships appeared on the horizon, great gray battleships, their flags foreign, their metal ominous. The prisoners stood on loading docks, feeling their stomachs tighten. One muttered, "Do you think they'll hang us at sea?" Silence. Another said, "It's better than being paraded through their cities on a leash." He was wrong. They weren't paraded. They weren't executed. They were herded onto ships like livestock. Yes, but not in chains. Just numbers called, papers shuffled, names recorded. The voyage across the Atlantic began, and with it, another layer of torment. Because silence? Silence is fertile ground for fear. The creaking of the hull, the distant clang of machinery. American guards speaking in slang-heavy English, laughing too often, whispering when the prisoners came near. Every noise sounded ominous. Every kindness seemed suspect, and yet nothing happened. They were fed, watered. Sometimes the guards even joked. It didn't make sense. Why treat condemned men so well? No answers came. Only rain on deck, long nights, and the haunting realization that this enemy didn't play the game they were promised. Most prisoners couldn't sleep. Others stared at the sea, waiting for the moment when the trick revealed itself, when the trap was sprung. Then one morning, the sun broke the horizon. And there, through thin mist, one of the prisoners spotted it. A woman, holding a torch, the Statue of Liberty. He couldn't speak, he just pointed. For a moment, the group went still. The land of their enemies had a woman welcoming foreigners carved out of stone? This place was supposed to be the executioner's throne. Instead, it looked almost mystical. But that awe quickly burned into terror again. Another soldier leaned toward the rail and muttered, "Do you think they'll hang us in front of her, so the world knows?" They were wrong. But the story was far from over, because what awaited them on American soil would confuse them more than any war propaganda ever had. It wouldn't be a bullet, it wouldn't be a rope. No. What came next? Was dinner. Section 2, The Journey into the Unknown. The sea was endless. Steel gray waves stretched to the horizon, each one pulling the prisoners further from everything they had ever known. Italy, already a distant memory, now belonged to another world, one of hunger, propaganda, and promises that had crumbled alongside the craters of North Africa. All that remained was the groan of engines, the roll of the Atlantic, and fear. Endless, gnawing fear. On board the American transport ships, thousands of Italian prisoners huddled below deck, packed into cavernous holds like cattle, eyes wide open even in sleep. The air was thick with sweat, oil, and silence. The cracks in the walls let in slivers of moonlight, but no answers. No one had explained anything. No one told them how long the voyage would take. No one told them where they were going. And no one confirmed or denied the rumors that hung in the air like smoke. The most persistent whisper? That these weren't prison ships, they were coffins, steel-trapped vessels headed for public executions in America. "They'll take us to Times Square," one soldier muttered, wrapping his coat tighter. "Hang us in front of the cameras. They want to make us an example." Another leaned against a bulkhead and mumbled, "I heard. They'll make us dig our own graves." He said it like a fact, like he'd held the shovel himself. Some tried to laugh it off, but the laughter snapped too quickly and didn't reach the eyes. Doubt clung like salt water in their clothes. Even the guards' indifference seemed to confirm it. They were dead men walking, just without the courtesy of final words. The Americans were young too, most of them barely older than the prisoners themselves, farm boys in oversized uniforms, chewing gum like they were killing time. They didn't seem cruel, just casual, detached, unreadable, and the prisoners could make no sense of it. Why weren't they shouting orders? Why did some of them smile? Why had one even offered a cigarette to a man clearly too terrified to speak? It made no sense. And in that void of understanding, the Italians turned inward, clinging to each other, to their keepsakes, to scraps of paper written in fading ink, as though those relics might protect them from whatever was coming, because the ocean offers no comfort. It offers only distance. And every wave whispered the same brutal question: why aren't we dead yet? Some prisoners wrote in journals shaky handwriting, capturing thoughts they didn't dare speak out loud. One wrote, "The longer they wait to kill us, the more it hurts. This is not mercy, it is torture." Another scribbled, "I have counted every bolt in this room, in case we need to use one to end it quickly." Hope had been a casualty long before they stepped onto the ship. And yet, contradictions grew like cracks in the hull. The food, while bland, was warm. The water was clean. When one man fell and broke his ribs, a medic came, bandaged him, gave him painkillers. They were still prisoners, yes. Guarded, watched, herded like livestock at every stop. But they weren't being abused, not starved, not kicked, not cursed. And that somehow terrified them more. Because cruelty, they understood. But kindness? That had to be a trick. Another wrote in his diary, "The Americans do not hit us. This is more unsettling than any blow. It means they are saving us for something worse." Each passing day, the silence deepened, both literal and emotional. The guards rarely spoke. No one explained the plan. There were no newspapers or radios in the hold, and so time blurred into a fog of anxious waiting. Every knock on the hull sounded like a signal. Every door hinge felt like it might open to your last moment. Every creak whispered, "Now, now, now." But the now never came. Instead, weeks into the voyage, land finally broke the horizon. The hold erupted with murmurs. Men pressed to the slotted windows, blinking like animals in the light. Skyscrapers rose like giants against the morning mist, backlit by the glowing outline of America. One man whispered, "Is this New York?" Another said nothing, just stared at the faint outline of a woman with a torch standing in the harbor. The Statue of Liberty. To immigrants, she symbolized welcome. To these prisoners, she looked like judgment set in stone. An Italian officer stared at her and said flatly, "She does not welcome us." To him, she wasn't an invitation. She was a witness. They still expected trucks filled with ropes, with cameras, with mobs. But something didn't feel right. As the gangplanks lowered, they waited, braced for clubs or shouts, maybe bullets. Their hearts pounded, hands trembled. Some muttered last prayers, others clenched fists in raw defiance. But none of what they expected came. Instead, orders. Calm, orderly directions. They were lined up, counted, photographed, assigned identification numbers. No blood, no shouting, no death. Just bureaucracy. One prisoner later recalled, "I kept waiting for the blow. It never came. The absence of pain was surreal. Like waking up in someone else's dream." From the bustling docks, they were loaded onto buses, not shackles. No one spat at them. No crowd screamed in hatred. In fact, few civilians even looked. To the prisoners' shock, their treatment wasn't hostile, it was efficient. Cold, mechanical perhaps, but never violent. That was the moment the dread began to shift. They still didn't understand what this meant. Not yet. But for the first time since that desert surrender, they realized death was not coming today. The buses rumbled forward, pushing deep into unfathomable countryside. Behind wire mesh windows, faces leaned against cold glass, watching a world that felt like fiction. Green fields spread far and wide, dotted with red barns and pastures full of lazy cattle. Children rode bikes beside the roads. Farmers waved. A few women stood on porches, shading their eyes as military vehicles passed. No screaming, no ropes, just America. Casual, bright, and endlessly confusing. How could the world look like this? They had been promised burning cities, mass graves, death lines. What they saw were homes with mailboxes, horses nibbling at hay, swing music on car radios next to gas stations. This was not war. This was something terrifying in its calmness. One prisoner said aloud, This is not possible. Where's the hunger? The punishment? The fury?" No one answered, because everyone had the same question. The journey stretched on for hours, then days. They stopped at military checkpoints, switched buses, ate meals in silence, slept on thin cots in temporary enclosures while further camps were prepared inland. Wherever they stopped, the fear followed. Many still believed that execution was just being delayed, postponed for political reasons or sadism. Some braced constantly for a trick, a fake camp, a meal followed by poison. They stayed awake at night, not from lack of comfort, but from total psychological collapse. They didn't trust kindness. They couldn't believe in survival. And still, nothing brutal happened. Eventually, they reached their destinations prisoner of war camps, nestled in the farmlands of Texas, Georgia, Nebraska, and Kansas. As they rolled through the gates, some squinted at the guard towers, looking for the gallows. But instead, they smelled something different. Something strange. Warm. Yeasty. Unbelievable. Bread. Freshly baked bread. For a few seconds, the men froze. It was a scent from memory from before the war, before the rations, before the desert. It felt like standing in their mother's kitchen again. And that memory, that impossible smell, shattered something in them. Some wept. Others turned away in shame. One prisoner whispered, "If this is a trick, it is a cruel and beautiful one." That night, they didn't sleep in chains. They lay on bunks. Some refused to close their eyes. Others clung to blankets as though they might be yanked away. But the guards didn't come. No one shouted. The darkness was merely darkness, not a trap. And slowly, One unshakable thought began to rise. Were we lied to? Had Mussolini's promises of death and honor been bluffs? Were these Americans not the monsters drawn in propaganda? But human beings? Could it be? They no longer hated them. That idea that maybe they were no longer the enemy was more frightening than any noose. It threatened everything they had been told, everything they had sacrificed, everything they believed. But the answers wouldn't come in that moment. Not yet, because the journey into the unknown wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Section 3. The First Feast. They thought it was a hallucination, a trick of smell, a memory playing games, a cruel mirage conjured up by tired minds in foreign soil. But it wasn't. The scent that drifted from the mess hall was unmistakable roasted meat, rich and slow-cooked, mingled with herbs and garlic. There were also deeper notes: butter, onions, something sweet, pie. Somewhere, pies were cooling. The warmth of the aroma hit the prisoners like a rushing wave. And not one of them moved. They stood at the entrance in rows, their faces blank, hands tucked at their sides like schoolboys who'd wandered into the wrong room. The guards made casual gestures for them to walk in, but the Italians didn't understand. This wasn't the noose. So what was it? Inside, the room was surreal. Long wooden tables stretched from wall to wall, draped in white cloths, real linen, not burlap or army canvas. The tables were groaning under the weight of platters, bowls, and trays. A golden army of roasted turkeys lined the center, their skin crackling like lacquered armor. Beside them sat heaping bowls of mashed potatoes, thick brown gravy, green beans, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pies, and baskets of steaming bread. And to their utter confusion, there was pasta. Real pasta, cooked questionably by American hands. Some Italians blinked twice. This wasn't food. This was a banquet. One man whispered through clenched teeth, "Is this our last meal?" Another responded softly, almost childlike, "There's no firing squad in the smell of cinnamon." Still, they didn't trust it. Because how do you trust the hands that claimed your weapons, your homeland, your surrender when they now offer gravy-spotted generosity? They entered slowly, eyes fixed to the floor. A few scanned the ceiling, as if expecting daggers to drop from the rafters, or poison gas to hiss from vents. Their boots scraped across the wooden floors like they were walking into a trap. But there were no commands, only spoons. And food. And something even more unnerving, the casual, almost indifferent presence of the guards, who stood back and watched them eat. Or didn't. One soldier leaned against the wall, sipping coffee, his thumb hooked into his belt, looking bored. "Do they want us to eat?" one prisoner asked his officer. There was no answer, only food waiting to be touched. Eventually, the hunger cracked the shell. One younger Italian, no older than 17, reached out, grabbed a roll of bread, and took a bite so fast it looked like instinct more than thought. Nothing happened. No one was shot. The guards didn't flinch. Another man followed, then another. Within minutes, the entire hall was filled with the soft clatter of cutlery and the guttural rhythm of desperate eating. For a moment, it might have looked like chaos, men tearing bread, eyes wide, mouths full before they Saturday. But then something stranger happened. They slowed down. Forks dipped gently into mashed potatoes. Hands reached timidly for second helpings. Bites became curious, almost reverent. This was not rations. This was not a trick. It was a feast. And it was real. Some men couldn't speak. Not because of the language barrier, but because tears had overtaken them. A lieutenant from Naples sat with his head bowed as gravy puddled beneath untouched turkey. He didn't touch the food for nearly 10 minutes, staring down at it like it might speak to him. Finally, he picked up a fork, stabbed a piece of stuffing, and cried as he chewed. Another man clutched his rosary while eating, a 1,000-yard stare frozen on his plate. Some laughed nervously, like they'd stumbled into a fantasy and expected to wake up surrounded by barbed wire and ash. But they didn't wake. This was real. This was Thanksgiving. What the Italians couldn't have known, what no one told them, was that among the American military's policies, this act wasn't random. It was calculated. The US knew exactly what it was doing. According to internal memos from the War Department, feeding prisoners well wasn't just a gesture of human decency, it was a form of psychological warfare. A full belly made you compliant, hospitality undermined propaganda. And most importantly, stories like this traveled. Each slice of pie was a bullet for the morale back home. Each steaming cup of coffee a grenade lobbed into fascist ideology. If Italian POWs wrote home, and many did, they would detail not torture, but dessert, not punishment, but pasta. Every bite had strategic value. But to the men at those tables, strategy didn't matter. What mattered was the memory it pulled from some old drawer in their hearts, the way their home smelled on holidays. Olive oil warming in a pan, garlic on a grandmother's fingers, bread with crusts so sharp they could cut skin. They ate and remembered mothers, aunts, sisters over boiling pots, all now somewhere across the Atlantic, surviving on boiled weeds and powdered flour. And here, in enemy land, they were being fed like kings. For some, the food came with guilt. One man wrote, "I ate until I couldn't breathe, and then I cried with the knowledge that my family in Sicily hasn't seen meat in a year." Others stared at the pasta and whispered under their breath, "They're mocking us." But the food wasn't mocking. The food was abundant. And abundance was its own kind of weapon, not for destruction, but for disarmament. That night, guards walked the barracks more slowly. Prisoners lay back on bunks, hands over full stomachs. The psychosis of fear had cracked just slightly. Some men couldn't sleep because of how full they were. Others lay awake, interrogating themselves with a deeper, sharper fear. Can we trust this? Were we the fools all along? What kind of enemy does this? A former officer wrote in his letter home, "I do not know how to process this. Are we prisoners? Or guests in a twisted hotel? I do not believe it. I cannot. But I cannot not believe it either." Another wrote, "My father always said Americans were pigs, but if they are pigs, then we have been starving in a land of ghosts." For the first time, Mussolini's voice began to fracture in their minds. His threats, the promises of martyrdom, the righteousness of dying in chains, it all began to smell like rot compared to the scent of roasted turkey. His speeches had warned of blood and rope, but the Americans gave them coffee and cornbread. There were smaller moments too, tiny gestures that chipped away at certainty. An American cook brought out a second tray of bread and chuckled, "Too dry?" pointing to the undercooked pasta. An Italian raised an eyebrow and replied, "A crime against cooking." And they both laughed. That laughter, tiny and strange, echoed across the barracks. Guards began loosening their posture. Prisoners began looking them in the eye again. Something had shifted. Irreversibly. In Texas, Georgia, Alabama, wherever these camps were, the story repeated. Massive feasts, whispered disbelief. A parade of confusion followed closely by hunger, then shame, then, somehow, hope. One curious fact appeared in official camp reports. Many Italian POWs gained weight during captivity. So much so, in fact, that it puzzled US officials. That statistic alone told the story that censored letters could not. Men who had once survived on worm-ridden biscuits were now joking with their captors and arguing good-naturedly about who knew real pasta. This wasn't surrender anymore. It was rebirth, or at least the beginning of it. And the wound that formed wasn't from cruelty, it was from contradiction. Because accepting kindness from the side that defeated you, that sliced deeper than any blade. Yet, despite the guilt, the shame, and the lingering fog of loyalty, the Thanksgiving meal in an American prison camp planted a seed no one could unplant. The enemy did not bring a noose, he brought a fork. And in the world of war, that made no sense. And yet, here they were, full, confused, and undeniably alive. Section 4, Life Behind the Fence. It wasn't just the food, it was everything after. The prisoners had expected the kindness to end as suddenly as it appeared that the Thanksgiving dinner was a puzzle piece in some larger psychological trap, a brief reprieve before the punishment resumed. But it didn't. The bread kept coming, the coffee stayed hot, and in the days that followed, something even more unsettling happened. Nothing horrible happened at all. Instead, the men were shown to long wooden barracks. Clean, dry, heated. The doors creaked open to reveal rows of bunk beds made with fresh sheets, wool blankets folded neatly like hotel linen. There were stoves inside, windows that opened, ventilation, real, moving air, not chains, no cement floors, no dark holes in the ground, just bedding. This was captivity? The guards said little. They pointed, gestured, kept things orderly. Some were clearly just following regulations, but others went further. One offered up a small joke with a thick accent. "You The turkey? And grinned when the Italian soldiers glared, then finally laughed. But laughter took time, because trust was still poisoned. Many prisoners sat rigid on their bunks, refusing to lie down. Some paced all night, certain it was a test. One man whispered into the dark, "They want us to relax before they strike." But the strike never came. In the following days, routines began to take shape. Wake-up calls, roll calls, meals, lights out. It was strange, mechanical, and eerily calm. Showers were discovered along one barracks wall. Warm water, gushing from real pressurized pipes like some industrial miracle. In Italy, even civilians barely had running water during wartime. Here, behind cages built by the enemy, they had steam rising beneath their fingertips. One prisoner wept as he held his hands beneath it. Then came the barbers. Scissors, razors, soap with a fragrance that transported them back to pre-war Sundays. Hair that had been wild for months was trimmed, beards shaved. For many, it was the first time in years they saw their own faces again, full of lines they didn't remember earning. One man stared into a cracked handheld mirror and whispered, "I look like my father the day he left for the Great War." Another collapsed onto the bench and said softly, "I look like a man." That was the unsettling part. They were beginning to feel human again, and in a strange way, that scared them more than the rope ever did. The camp itself was nothing like the places Mussolini's doctrine had prepared them for. The fences were real tall and barbed. Guard towers stood at every corner. Yes, they were prisoners, no pretenses there. But inside the wire, it was order, not punishment. Structure, not violence. They had access to medical care like they'd never seen. Canteens sold writing supplies. Some camps allowed recreational areas where prisoners kicked soccer balls, played cards, even gathered for small concerts. At one camp, an officer with university training offered language lessons. Men who had once trampled through Libya holding rifles now sat at makeshift desks with pencils and dictionaries, repeating words like window, cloud, and thank you. It felt impossible. And then came the letters. For weeks, the men had imagined their families thought them dead. They'd steeled themselves for the silence that comes after defeat. But now, they were given writing material and permission to write home. Under military censor, of course. Nothing subversive. No troop movements. No attempts at politics. But what they could write was simple. I'm alive, I'm safe, I'm being treated well. For many, putting those words to paper felt both healing and heretical. Because how do you explain to your mother, who lines up for 2 hours to get a loaf of black bread back home, that your enemy gave you apple pie? How do you write to your brother, still dodging bombs in Naples, that you now sleep in a heated barracks with a full stomach? That emotional fracture ran deep. One man faced the blank paper for over an hour before finally scrawling, "I do not know how to say what I must. I am well better than anyone at home. This is not what I was told it would be." Another's letter, discovered later in an archive, said simply, "They have won, not just the war. They have won something inside me." But not all the prisoners accepted this shift so easily. Some clung fiercely to ideology. Officers especially, still loyal to fascist command, refused to eat certain meals, claiming they wouldn't accept handouts from Americans. Others organized small pockets of resistance, holding secret night meetings to preserve dignity. One man punched another for smiling at a guard. Another tore up a crossword puzzle gifted by an American cook. "They are trying to convert us," he said, "and I will not become what I was taught to kill." But hunger has no ideology, and shame runs silent. Within weeks, cracks formed even among the most loyal. The man who threw away the crossword? Weeks later, he was seen doing another. In pencil. Quietly. The officer who refused his meal took seconds one cold morning, muttering something about practicality. Prix de staves, hungerservius. Camp reports began documenting strange new phenomena. Requests for extra books. Volunteers applying for labor details under American farms. Prisoners teaching Italian cooking techniques to mess sergeants. At a camp in Nebraska, a group of prisoners built an outdoor oven and began baking bread the right way. They offered the first loaf to a guard, joking, "This is how real enemies bake." The guard laughed and ate the bread. A strange warmth began to bubble beneath the surface. Guards stopped seeing the enemy and started seeing names. Stories. Men. They started trading phrases. Awkward Italian-English sentences floated through barracks, like children learning how to communicate for the first time. One guard said, "Good morning." A prisoner shot back, "Too loud, a coffee," and both grinned. It didn't take lectures or surrender ceremonies. It took dinners, shared routines, a book passed from one man to another, a soccer match played without keeping score. Through it all hung one terrible, beautiful truth. They had been promised death, but were instead given dignity. And no one knew what to do with that, because betrayal is a hard pill to swallow. Not betrayal of your country, but of the story you were told about your enemy. How do you hate someone who feeds you better than your own government did? And the guilt deepened. Not out of fear, but out of comfort. One man confessed in his diary, "I eat well, I have clean clothes, and at night I dream of my sister digging through garbage bins in Rome. What sort of man feels shame over a warm bed?" Another wrote, "We used to fear the gun, now we fear the mirror." By Christmas, the transformation was subtle but irreversible. The same hands that once trembled over imagined executions were now carving toys for military families, sewing buttons onto American uniforms, singing folk songs into cold December air beside barracks warmed with fire. At Camp Aliceville in Alabama, the prisoners built a chapel with their own hands, a place to pray under the sky of the country they were supposed to hate. Locals would visit it decades later, still shocked that their enemy made something worthy of worship. What began with food turned into faith, routine, dignity. And a bizarre truth started to take shape in secret conversations, in letters carefully worded to pass censors, in half-whispered jokes under breath. If this is prison, what was freedom? But the story wasn't over, because what none of them knew yet, not even the guards, was that this strange experiment in mercy was about to evolve again. The Americans weren't done, and the next transformation would challenge not only their loyalty, but their role in the war itself. Section 5. From Prisoners to Partners. By mid-1944, the desert was a distant memory. For the thousands of Italian prisoners now scattered across prison camps in America, the sun-bleached battlefield of Tunisia felt like another lifetime. The fear of execution had vanished, replaced instead by something more unsettling comfort. Not luxury, not freedom, but consistency. Clean sheets, hot meals, warm showers, and the strange realization that the men who once pointed rifles at you were now drinking the same coffee and nodding across the mess hall. But the most jarring chapter hadn't even begun yet. Because that summer, everything changed again. Back in Europe, Italy's government had fractured. Mussolini's fascist regime was in pieces. Hitler had propped him up as the head of a puppet state in the north, but in southern Italy, the king had signed an armistice with the Allies. Italy, at least in name, was no longer an enemy. It was now an ally. The War Department took notice. So did military command. And soon, an opportunity was presented to the prisoners in America, one that none of them could have imagined hearing a year earlier. "You can help us." The offer came with structure, uniforms, and paperwork. If the Italians wanted to leave their idle lives behind the wire, they were given a choice: sign a loyalty oath pledging allegiance to the new anti-fascist Italian government, and in return, be transferred out of traditional captivity and placed into Italian service units. They would not fight, but they would work, repairing vehicles, sewing uniforms, loading cargo, working in warehouses, kitchens, laundry facilities, and even guarding German POWs. They would be under American command, but still soldiers, still Italian, just on the other side. It was an absurd fork in the road. Do you stay a prisoner or become a partner? Some didn't hesitate. They'd already buried Mussolini in their minds, their loyalty ground down by hunger, kindness, and the sound of Glenn Miller music floating through the Kansas wind. To them, the oath wasn't complicity, it was practicality. Survival. A chance to work, move, regain some control. But others felt something deeper, darker. Betrayal. For a small but vocal group of prisoners, this wasn't a choice, it was a test. They called those who signed traitors, collaborators, Americani in uniform. And some held to their fascist roots with raw-knuckled pride. These men branded themselves the irreducibili, the unbreakables. They refused the oath, refused the work, refused to speak English, even to guards who had become friendly faces. To them, siding with the Allies was not practical. It was spiritual surrender. In some camps, tensions flared. Shouted arguments in the barracks. Fistfights over loyalty. One man was beaten for wearing his newly issued Italian service patch to breakfast. He didn't retaliate. He simply said, "I would rather work than rot. What does that make me?" And no one had a clean answer. But for the vast majority of prisoners, the choice was clear. Nearly 90% signed the oath. Almost overnight, men who once feared hanging were now wearing uniforms again, this time without fear. Their insignia bore no fascist crest, just Italy embroidered over a pocket. An old identity was shattered. A new one was sewn into place. The transformation was both monumental and mundane. They were transferred into working camps. Trucks picked them up at dawn. They rode out to fields, armories, supply bases, anywhere extra hands were needed. Some sorted shipments of uniforms for U.S. servicemen heading to the Pacific. Others cooked meals under guidance from American sergeants. More still harvested crops, standing shoulder to shoulder with Midwestern farmers who, a year earlier, might have swore they'd never feed foreign soldiers. And that's what they were now, workers, not prisoners, collaborators maybe, but with calloused hands and a pocket full of canteen credits. They were paid. Not in dollars, but in tokens they could use at the canteen, enough for writing paper, soap, matches, tobacco. Some saved up to buy gifts for American children they met on farms. Others started requesting English dictionaries. The appetite for usefulness grew, because working meant meaning. One farmer's wife in Iowa recalled decades later, "They worked the fields like they were their own, always singing, always grateful. There was one young man, after our daughter gave him an apple, he carved her a horse out of wood. She kept it her whole life." Another prisoner was given permission to paint the wall of a recreation barracks. He illustrated the Italian countryside with vines, gardens, olive trees, and rooftops. The Americans let him keep the brushes. The mural still exists today. But cracks still surface now and then. For even those who adapted, those who toiled and smiled and made jokes with guards beneath it all, emotional friction smoldered. Because contributing to the enemy's war effort wasn't just physically exhausting, it was existentially confusing. One man wrote in a journal, "They feed us, they pay us, they treat us like men, but will our country forgive us for surviving?" Another confessed during interrogation, "The war stopped feeling real, I do not know what I am anymore." Still, the work gave them more than identity. It gave them rhythm. And rhythm creates community. Camps became halfway homes. Lines faded. The term prisoner was now as much about memory as it was about status. A few guards even admitted in reports that they no longer saw themselves as watchdogs. One soldier from Louisiana wrote to his fiancée, "I used to watch them through wire. Now I watch their backs while they fix generators. It's awkward, but real." And perhaps the strangest turn of all? Some of the Italians' men who once considered Americans demons began to view them as something even harder to define. Decent, familiar, and frighteningly close. Homesickness persisted, haunting everything. Every loaf of American white bread reminded them of hard Italian crusts. Every Thanksgiving turkey reminded them of wartime mothers boiling chestnuts over campfires in Sicily. No matter how warm the beds, home still ached. And letters from Europe were cruel reminders of the difference between perception and reality. One man learned his family had been bombed out of their home. Another was told his father had died due to lack of medicine. A third received a letter from his wife, reading, "You eat well, then eat for all of us. There are days I forget what food is." One diary captured it bluntly. "We grow fat in farmland while they starve in ruins. Is this who we've become?" The Americans knew it too. They didn't gloat, didn't preach. But for all their strategy and quiet discipline, they understood the contradiction they'd created. To treat prisoners better than their own country did would leave scars that wouldn't be visible until years later. But they stuck with it, because they believed in something bigger than hatred. Control through fairness, power through respect. Or maybe, as one colonel put it bluntly, a full man doesn't riot. As the final year of the war arrived, POW camps in America began to shift again. Some prisoners became unofficial staff. Others learned English well enough to translate for new arrivals. A few were given special permission to fraternize with local churches performing outreach. One group even built a chapel with their own hands. No orders, no funding, just scrap wood, nails, and prayers cobbled together into a kind of thank you card to dignity. None of this was commanded. It all came voluntarily, from men who had survived the rope only to be bound by something stranger, respect. By the time American newspapers announced the death of Mussolini in 1945, the loyalty divide had mostly dissolved inside the camps. There were few fascist holdouts left, even fewer men who still used the word enemy. The rest just wanted to finish the job and go home to something if it still existed. But not all of them would return to Italy as they left it, because captivity and everything that came with it had changed them. If Mussolini had promised glory through bullets, and America had offered humanity through bread, the choice now seemed obvious. Yet scars don't always fade with distance. The men who would step off ships post-war carried with them not just stories of war, but stories of contradiction, of mercy, of friendship offered by the hand that once held a gun. Some would push those memories away, others would share them. And a few would never return at all, choosing instead to make lives in the very country they once feared. Because America didn't just capture an army, it captured something deeper, a part of their truth. A truth that even they couldn't deny anymore. That sometimes the enemy wins the war, not with bullets, but with bread, boots, and a job to do. Section 6, The Long Goodbye. By 1945, the guns had finally gone quiet. Germany surrendered. Mussolini's reign had ended in violence. The Axis powers collapsed under the weight of their own promises, leaving behind ruins, broken cities, and questions no flag could answer. In the United States, celebration rang through the streets. Cities erupted in spontaneous parades. Fireworks cracked above courthouses. Strangers kissed in public without words. But inside the POW camps that dotted rural America, quiet places tucked behind wheat fields and cotton rows, the prisoners didn't cheer. They packed. Steel ships waited at harbor again, not to bring them to fear, but to carry them back to the homeland they hadn't seen in years. Some had been gone since 1941. Others had missed the birth of their children, the death of their parents, the slow erosion of the world they once thought they were defending. Now they would go home, but not as men of honor, not as victors, not even as villains. They were going home as prisoners who had not suffered. And for many, that was harder to explain than dying would have been. In the final weeks, the mood inside camps was strange and quiet. Men cleaned their bunks, folded uniforms they wouldn't wear again. Chapels were dusted one last time, murals were touched up, as if preserving the memory mattered more than they expected. Guards, now familiar faces, gave awkward parting handshakes. A few gave gifts a pack of cigarettes, a book, homemade food tucked into a satchel. One lieutenant received a small American flag stitched carefully by a soldier's wife. She'd written a note. "So you'll remember the country that surprised you." He folded it quietly. None of them knew what to say. Because what do you say to the guard who once looked at you like a threat but had since spent winters sharing coffee by the barracks stove? What do you say to the farm family who gave you leftover apples, who let your songs echo across their fields on your lunch break? What do you say when the enemy treated you like a son? You say nothing. You carry it home, like a pebble in your shoe, like a permanent truth in your bones. Some prisoners begged to stay. Official records show that hundreds petitioned for U.S. residency, offering to keep working farms, factories, or military posts for no wage. They didn't want to go back not out of cowardice, but because they feared what they'd find back home. Italy was in rubble, families scattered, fascism a ghost still whispering in some corners. They may have hated the wire fences at first, but now, those fences meant structure, safety, food, predictability. What waited across the sea? Nothing but uncertainty. When the ships came, they boarded in silence. Gone were the cries of fear from their first voyage, the suspicion that they were being hauled off for execution. Now they knew better. And yet, there was grief. Not for leaving America, but for leaving this version of themselves, the one who had rediscovered humility, rest, and identity just when all seemed lost. One man later wrote in a letter, "I left for war proud. I returned from prison peaceful. I don't know which man my country wants back." The voyage home was slower and heavier. Some ships passed Allied convoys, bringing troops back in the opposite direction. Soldiers who had faced the worst of the war on the front lines and now returned with medals, shell shock, and stories. The Italians avoided their gaze when they passed on the ship decks. Some felt like imposters. Others felt relieved to be unknown. But all of them carried something no one could see, gratitude dressed as guilt. And then came the shore, Italy. But if home was supposed to be warm, familiar, and welcoming, It wasn't. They came back to towns that barely resembled the ones they'd grown up in. Craters in the streets, rubble where schools once stood, mothers with gray in their hair from years of hunger, brothers leaning on canes from old bomb wounds. The children didn't recognize them. Wives looked older, and neighbors looked at them strangely. Because, while the war had ground on without mercy, these men had gained weight. Their skin wasn't weathered from frontline frostbite, their jackets still fit. Their faces weren't hollow like the rest. One prisoner recalled walking into his old village and being greeted not with a hug, but with a muttered insult. Fat like a German, and full like a traitor. Shame bloomed fast. They tried explaining, "We thought we'd be hanged. We expected to be worked to death. We didn't ask for their kindness, it just happened." But the words fell flat. Suffering doesn't argue with survival. And some survivors hate to be reminded that someone, somewhere, didn't have to suffer like they did. Some went silent. They buried the stories, the feasts, the pie, the swing music on Kansas evenings. They sealed those memories like letters that had never been sent. Others spoke freely, especially those who would eventually emigrate. They told their children about the mess halls that smelled like gravy, about teaching Americans how to cook real pasta, about building altars out of scrap wood in Alabama. They told stories without bitterness, only breathless disbelief. And slowly, the memory of their captivity reshaped their lives. Some returned to farms, copying American techniques they'd seen. Others opened bakeries, recreating the white bread that once felt like softness itself. A few moved to America for good and became citizens of the country they had once feared would hang them by the neck. One man opened an Italian restaurant in Illinois. On Thanksgiving, he always cooked for the homeless turkeys, mashed potatoes, and pie. "I was fed by the enemy," he told friends, "and it saved me. I repay it this way." Another served in Italy's post-war reconstruction, designing schools based on the camp layout he remembered in Nebraska. "It wasn't beautiful," he said, "but it was organized, and it made me feel like a man again." Not everyone flourished. Some drank. Others never slept more than 4 hours again. A few refused to look at American products for the rest of their lives, but they remembered. Always. The food, the songs, the jokes, the guards who tried to say grazy and butchered it before smiling anyway. One man summed it up best in a letter written decades later. "I surrendered hoping for nothing. I left with something I can't explain. The Americans won that war with weapons, yes, but for us, they won with bread, and I don't know whether to love them or resent them for it." The legacies lasted even longer than the stories. In towns across the American Midwest and South, remnants still remain. Murals, carvings, chapels, camps converted into historical memorials. Locals tell stories not just of prisoners, but of friends, pen pals, part-time farmhands who returned every harvest season for years before finally going back to Italy. Children today still grow up hearing about the friendly Italians their grandparents met behind fences. It's a piece of history that never looked like a war story. There are no flashy battle sequences, no medals, no drones or explosions. No hero's charge, just men who were supposed to be the enemy, who were instead handed a fork, offered a chair, and reminded of what it meant to be treated like a human being. That's the part no one saw coming. That mercy not firepower would be the sharpest weapon. And that when the war faded into the quiet of memory, it would be the Thanksgiving tables, not the battlefields, that stayed vivid. In one prisoner's old journal, now archived in a dusty museum basement, a final entry reads, "The Americans never raised a whip. They raised bread. And still, all these years later, when I break mine at the table, I remember what it meant to be seen as a man, when the world had told me I was nothing." Epilogue. A war won at the table. War is usually told in explosions. It's remembered through grainy footage of tanks rolling through mud. Through cracked helmets, flyovers, victory parades. We mark it with red arrows on maps, medals, timelines, and casualty counts carved into stone. But sometimes, the most transformative victories don't happen on battlefields at all. They happen at dinner tables, decades after the North African campaign ended. After Italian soldiers stacked their rifles into the sand and braced for hanging, the world is still reckoning with the quiet power of what happened next. Because for thousands of Italians, the war didn't end with surrender. It ended with bread. Historians have spent decades trying to quantify the psychological shift. Some call it America's most successful soft power campaign of the war. Others dismiss it as an anomaly, a quirk of geography, timing, or morale policy. But ask the men who lived it. Ask those who expected nooses and got pumpkin pie. Ask the farmers who watched enemy soldiers become seasonal family, and they'll tell you it was no accident, the strategy of mercy. From the start, the United States government anticipated the challenge of housing prisoners of war. But the Geneva Convention of 1929, the International Agreement on Rights and Protections of Captured Servicemen, wasn't just a legal code. To the Americans, it became a playbook. Treat prisoners with dignity. Feed them well, house them cleanly, let them worship, write, work. Not just because it was moral, because it was efficient, effective, disarming. Every well-fed Italian POW became a living contradiction, a walking challenge to the fascist narrative. Stories filtered back through censored letters and post-war conversations. The Americans don't beat us. They gave us clean sheets. They let us sing songs. They cooked pasta the wrong way, but they tried. When those stories reached Axis lines, they didn't always inspire awe. They inspired doubt. Doubt is poison to propaganda. And nothing spreads doubt like the voice of a soldier who was supposed to be executed and instead gained weight. U.S. military analysts noticed it too. One internal military report joked that the prisoners were returning to Italy rounder than when captured, but noted seriously that these same men were now undermining fascist control simply by telling the truth. The enemy didn't hang them. The enemy fed them better than their own government had. It wasn't just a kindness. It was a blow struck at the very heart of Mussolini's ideology. Bread carried in what bullets couldn't. Personal revolutions. The most profound transformations didn't happen in speeches. They happened in quiet corners. In the mess halls after Thanksgiving. In the workshops where Italians stitched uniforms for soldiers they once fought. In the chapels they built by hand, not for politics, but for peace. Men who came into the war full of purpose, certainty, and fear left camp uncertain of everything they thought they knew. One man, when asked decades later what changed him, didn't mention the rations, the camp structure, or the jobs. He simply said, "They looked me in the eye. They saw a man, not an enemy." That was the beginning of the end for fascism and for my hate. Some clung harder to pride, unwilling to speak of the kindness they received. Others wore it like a brand showing off American chewing gum to stunned neighbors back home. But all were changed. Because no one walks into a foreign land expecting death and walks out of it feeling human again without carrying something deep inside, the legacy in America. The legacy didn't just live in Italy. In small towns across Kansas, Texas, Nebraska, Iowa, and Georgia, the memories never vanished. Children who played outside the wire grew up to become grandparents with stories of the Italian men in the fields. Some remembered the music, some remembered the laughter. Others remembered something quieter, the way prisoners waved goodbye even after the war had ended. Camps were slowly dismantled after 1945. Barracks were torn down, mess halls converted, outposts abandoned. But in a few places, the echoes remain. In Alabama, the chapel still stands. In Nebraska, a small museum keeps hand-carved horses left by POWs on display. In Georgia, murals on old wooden walls show sun-drenched Tuscan hills painted by men who hadn't seen Italy in years, but never stopped dreaming of it. In those spaces, you don't see enemies. You see people. Absurd and beautiful. There's a line, midway through this story, too absurd to be fiction. The Americans won not with bullets, but with butter. It was real. It was written by a prisoner. And it was true. The rope never came. No mobs greeted them. No executions were staged. Instead, there were linens and libraries and fields full of wheat. Even the beginner's spaghetti cooked too soft became a joke shared across cultures, not a mark of disrespect. Those who returned to Italy carried rage, yes, at what had been done to their country, at how they'd been lied to, at how the enemy had shown more dignity than their own leaders. But they also carried gratitude, regret, complexity, emotion they had no language for. That's the part most war stories skip. What war does to your body is only half the story. The other half is what it leaves in your soul, quiet questions that still echo. The final legacy isn't one of records or statistics, though those exist. It's a question. A question that sits heavy across every plate of turkey passed across enemy lines. A question that can't be answered through battle maps or flag waving. Why would the most powerful country in the war show such mercy when it had every reason not to? Was it military strategy? Was it arrogance? Religious conviction? A surplus too big to ignore? Or was it a message? A quiet message to the world, to foes and allies alike, that cruelty isn't strength. And compassion doesn't make you weak. Maybe that message reached farther than we know. Not through speeches, but through letters home where soldiers wrote, "They feed me better than I've ever been fed. They gave me work. They gave me dignity." If this is being a prisoner, I do not know what freedom means anymore. We still live in a world of conflict. Still drawing borders, still shouting across political lines, still afraid of the other, no matter what flag they fly. But this story, this strange and quiet chapter of World War II, reminds us of something else. That the son of your enemy is not your enemy. That even in war, there are choices. And that sometimes the path to peace doesn't start with a white flag, but with a full plate. Final thoughts. No one ever built a statue for the guards who handed out cigarettes behind the wire. No textbook gives a full chapter to the Thanksgiving meals in Georgia barracks. No Hollywood film captures the absurd beauty of someone expecting bullets and finding biscuits instead. But maybe it should, because something happened in those camps. Something quiet, something human, and in the end, it might have been one of the war's most lasting victories. Not of nations, but of dignity. One final diary entry, found years after the war, written in worn Italian on the back of a paper napkin from a camp mess hall. The rope never arrived. The bullet stayed in its shell, and instead, they gave us chairs and silverware. A seat at the table. I came here ready to die. I left wondering if mercy was a greater weapon than all the rest. Asterisk, asterisk. The war was fought with steel and fire. But in one quiet corner of history, it was won with bread.